Joe Hollister's hands, cracked and weathered like old leather, pressed against the cold stone. Above him, carved into the rock, were words faded by time. Mackenzie Mining Company, 1792. It said the final seal was placed exactly 100 years ago. The main tunnel yawned open behind him, a dark throat leading back to the world. But here, this barrier stood firm, deliberate. Someone had sealed this part of the mine for good. In the mortar between the old stones, it looked fresh. Someone had been here recently. His lantern cast a nervous, dancing light across the dusty floor. It picked out scattered things, relics from a forgotten time. A child's wooden horse, blackened with age. A woman's boot, its brass buckles turned a sickly green. A man's pocket watch, its glass face shattered, its hands frozen forever at 11:47. 100 years these things had waited in the dark. 100 years of silence. But the silence had been broken. Mixed in with the ancient dust were fresh boot prints. Not his. Nearby lay a modern surveyor's compass, gleaming in the lamplight, and next to it, a set of railroad documents. The date on them was from last week. Someone was here. Someone was disturbing this grave. Joe knelt, his eyes drawn to a leather satchel. Its surface was a spiderweb of cracks. He carefully opened it. Inside, yellowed papers. The Mackenzie family's mining claims, land deeds, and a letter the ink faded but the words still screaming with desperation. October 1792. It told a story of a family, pioneers, driven from their land, their future stolen by powerful men who wanted what was theirs. A tale as old as the mountains themselves. But underneath that century-old tragedy was something that made his blood run cold. Fresh railroad survey maps. His lantern beam traced the lines. They showed this exact tunnel, and there were notes scrawled in the margins. Obstruction removal. Claim disputes resolved. Then he heard it. Voices, echoing from the tunnel entrance behind him. They were moving fast, their words urgent whispers swallowed by the dark. They weren't supposed to be here. No one was supposed to know he was here. And from beyond the stone barrier, another sound. A sound that didn't belong. A faint metallic tapping, rhythmic, deliberate. It wasn't random. It was a code. Modern telegraph code. It spelled out a single, desperate word. H-E-L-P. A wave of horror washed over Joe. He hadn't stumbled into one mystery, he'd stumbled into two. A century apart, but tangled together by the same dark thread of greed. The Mackenzies were forced out 100 years ago, and now someone was trying to silence the men who had just discovered what really happened. The voices grew closer. The tapping grew more frantic, and Joe finally understood the fear in old Clarabelle's eyes when she sent him here. This wasn't just about an old mine. This was about burying the truth. Twice. Joe flattened himself against the cold tunnel wall, his heart hammering against his ribs. The voices were getting louder, closer. In his hand, he clutched the Mackenzie family documents. The old papers felt as fragile as dried leaves, but their words were dynamite. Mining claims to a fortune. Stolen. Stolen with forged papers and threats of violence. Exactly 100 years ago. From behind the stone wall, the tapping continued. H-E-L-P. Someone was alive back there. Trapped. And now Joe knew why. They were railroad surveyors. They must have found what he just found. The proof. The century-old crime. He went this way, a gruff voice echoed down the tunnel. The sound was sharp, bouncing off the rock. Tracks lead straight to the sealed section. Lucius ain't gonna like this, another voice answered, lower, nervous. Told us to keep everyone away from the Mackenzie site. The Mackenzie site. The name hit Joe like a physical blow. So they knew. The man they called Lucius, he knew exactly what this place was. He knew what was hidden here. The crime that had built his family's fortune. Joe should have listened to the old woman. Clarabelle. The first voice spoke again. She said he was asking questions, poking around the mining records. Clarabelle. Of course. She knew about the Mackenzies. That's why she sent him. It wasn't a trap. She was sending in the only person she knew who was stubborn enough, or desperate enough, to walk into the lion's den. The footsteps stopped, right outside the chamber where he was hiding. A bright beam of light from a powerful lantern sliced through the darkness, sweeping across the entrance. The light illuminated everything: the ancient tragic relics of the Mackenzie family, and the modern surveying equipment left behind by the men now trapped behind the wall. "Look at this mess," one of the men grunted. "Someone's been going through the old stuff." Joe held his breath. He had been careful. He hadn't disturbed the old artifacts, which meant the surveyors had. Before they were sealed in, they had been examining the evidence. They knew. They knew the truth that could destroy the most powerful man in the territory. "Boss wants this whole section cleared out," the gruff voice said. "Needs it done before the federal investigators arrive next week." Federal investigators. Joe's mind reeled. This was bigger than a railroad dispute. Much bigger. Someone, somewhere, had filed a formal complaint about fraudulent mining claims. After 100 years, the government was finally looking into the crimes that built this territory. "What about the surveyors?" the nervous man asked. The reply was cold, final. "They've seen too much." Lucius made that clear. From behind the wall, the tapping started again. Faster this time. Desperate. The trapped men knew. They knew their time was running out. Joe looked down at the documents in his hand. The last letter from Thomas Mackenzie, dated October 1792. He described how men with guns had forced his family off their legal claim, how the local sheriff had been paid to look the other way, how the truth was buried deep in the earth, along with his family's dreams. It was the exact same thing happening right now. "Search the chamber," the gruff voice commanded. "If someone's been digging around, they might still be close." The lantern beam swept back into the sealed area. It passed inches from where Joe was hiding. The light caught something he hadn't seen before: fresh chisel marks around the edges of the stone barrier. Someone had reinforced the seal, and they'd done it recently, in the last week. The man with the lantern stepped into the chamber. His boots crunched on the loose rock. Joe could hear the man's heavy breathing, just feet away from him. He watched as the man scanned the scattered evidence, the proof of two crimes a century apart. Then the man bent down. He picked up one of the yellow documents that had slipped from Joe's grasp. "Well, well," the man said, his voice a low drawl. "Looks like our drifter found more than we thought." The man Tom held the yellowed paper up to his lantern, his eyes squinting at the faded script. "Original Mackenzie mining deed," he breathed, the words a mix of awe and pure terror. "Dated 1792. His voice trembled slightly. "This is it. This is what the boss has been so worried about." Joe didn't move a muscle. He was a statue carved from the same rock as the tunnel wall. He watched as the man kept reading, his face growing paler with every line. That single sheet of paper was legal proof. Proof that the entire Blackwell fortune, the foundation of their power for 100 years, was built on a lie, built on stolen land. If that paper ever saw the light of day, if it ever reached the federal investigators, generations of theft would be exposed. Suddenly, the tapping from behind the barrier changed. It wasn't just a desperate cry for help anymore. The rhythm was sharp, precise. Deliberate Morse code, THEYHAVETHEDEEDS. The man with the lantern froze, his head snapping toward the stone wall. "They know," he whispered. "The surveyors. They found the documents before we sealed them in." "Tom?" Another voice called out from the main tunnel, impatient. "What's taking so long?" "We got a bigger problem than just a drifter," Tom yelled back, his voice cracking. "Someone's got the original Mackenzie papers." Footsteps pounded towards them, fast and heavy. A second man burst into the chamber. This one was different. He wore a dusty coat, but pinned to it was a deputy's badge. Deputy Walsh, the local law. Joe's stomach twisted into a knot. It wasn't just a cover-up. The law was in on it. Both the crime 100 years ago and the one happening right now. "Let me see those," Walsh demanded, snatching the document from Tom's hand. He held it close to the lantern, his lips moving as he read. The color drained from his face. "These are the papers," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Thomas Mackenzie's great-grandson. He filed a complaint. These are the exact documents the federal investigators are coming to find." The tapping from behind the barrier grew more frantic, more urgent. It wasn't just tapping anymore. It was pounding. The men trapped inside were using their tools, their fists, anything they had. They knew. They had found the historical evidence, the smoking gun that could unravel a century of lies, and now their captors were reading it. How did the surveyors get their hands on these? Walsh asked, his eyes wide with panic. Must have found them when they were mapping the tunnels, Tom replied, his gaze darting around the chamber. These old mines connect for miles. The Mackenzie cache was probably scattered all through this section. Joe's mind raced. A cache. Not just one document. The Mackenzie family hadn't just been driven off their land. Before they fled, they had hidden the evidence. All of it. Scattered it throughout the tunnels, creating a time capsule of their legal rights. The surveyors hadn't just stumbled upon a letter. They'd stumbled upon an archive. Box them up, Walsh ordered, his voice suddenly hard, decisive. All of it. The old papers, the surveying equipment, anything that proves anyone was ever in this tunnel. But then a new sound came from behind the barrier. It wasn't tapping. It was voices. Faint, weak, but unmistakably human. The sound of men at the very edge of their endurance. Help us, one voice pleaded, cracked and dry. We've cataloged everything. We know about the Mackenzie claims. We know what you did in 1792. Walsh walked slowly toward the stone barrier, his face a mask of conflict. He was a lawman, but he was trapped. How much did you document? He asked, his voice low. Photographs, came the weak reply. Detailed measurements. We sent preliminary reports back to Washington before you trapped us in here. Joe saw the shift in Walsh's expression. The flicker of worry ignited into full-blown panic. It was too late. The secret was already out. Filing reports with federal authorities meant that killing these men wouldn't stop the investigation. It would guarantee it. It would turn a land fraud case into a murder investigation. Deputy, Tom whispered, his voice urgent, terrified. If they've already reported to Washington. I know, Walsh snapped, but his voice carried the heavy weight of a man realizing he'd been played, that he had crossed a line for a man named Blackwell, and there was no going back. The pounding from behind the barrier grew into a desperate, frantic drumming. They were using everything they had left, trying to break through, trying to convince the men on the other side that their only way out was to cooperate. But as Walsh raised his lantern, ready to examine the barrier more closely, another sound echoed from the deep darkness of the main tunnel. The sound of approaching horses, heavy, purposeful footsteps. Lucius Blackwell was coming, and he was coming to clean up this century-old mess himself, once and for all. Joe slid deeper into the shadows, pressing himself behind a pile of fallen rock until he was one with the darkness. The Mackenzie documents lay scattered on the ground, 100 years of secrets illuminated in the stark lantern light. If Blackwell saw those papers, it was over. Any hope for the trapped surveyors, any hope for justice, would die right here in this dusty, forgotten chamber. Walsh! The voice that boomed through the tunnel was deep, commanding, and laced with cold iron. It was the voice of a man used to being obeyed without question. Report! The deputy scrambled, trying to gather the yellow documents, but they were everywhere, scattered like autumn leaves across the chamber floor. Mining claims, land deeds, personal letters from the Mackenzie family. All the proof needed to show that the Blackwell dynasty was built on nothing but theft and violence. Sir, we have complications, Walsh called back, his voice strained, tight with a fear that went beyond just getting in trouble. Lucius Blackwell strode into the chamber. He was flanked by two men, both carrying rifles, their faces hard and unreadable. Even in the dim, flickering light, Joe could see the resemblance. It was the same face described in Thomas Mackenzie's last desperate letter. The same cold, calculating eyes. The same arrogant set of the jaw that had terrified and intimidated honest families a century ago. It was a legacy of cruelty, passed down from father to son. What complications? Blackwell's gaze swept the room and then fell upon the scattered papers. His face, which had been a mask of impatient authority, went rigid. All the color drained from it. How did these surface? He hissed, the words sharp and venomous. The railroad surveyors, Walsh explained, his words tumbling out in a rush. They found them while they were mapping the tunnel system. They were hidden all through this section. The Mackenzies, they must have scattered their legal papers before they were driven out during the territorial expansion. Behind the thick stone barrier, the trapped men had gone silent. They were listening, waiting. Joe could see Blackwell's jaw working, the muscles clenching and unclenching as he processed the disaster unfolding in front of him. The surveyors hadn't just found evidence of him trapping them. They had found the original sin, the fraud that his entire family's power was built on. These documents should have been destroyed decades ago, Blackwell said, his voice a low growl. He bent down and picked up Thomas Mackenzie's final letter. As he read the faded ink, his face grew even darker. This describes everything: the forged deeds, the bribed officials, the armed intimidation. He looked up, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "Sir, there's more," Tom interjected, his voice barely a whisper. "The surveyors, they said they photographed everything. They sent preliminary reports to Washington." Blackwell's head snapped up. "What reports?" And from behind the barrier, a voice, weak but defiant, called out, "Federal land fraud investigation. We documented 17 separate instances of fraudulent mining claims dating back to 1792, all of them connected to your family's holdings." The chamber fell silent. The only sound was the ragged, heavy breathing of Lucius Blackwell. Joe could almost see the gears turning in the man's mind, calculating the damage, weighing his rapidly dwindling options. "How long have they been trapped?" Blackwell asked, his voice dangerously calm. "4 days," Walsh replied. "And they've had no contact with the outside?" "None that we know of." Blackwell looked down at the ancient documents in his hand. Then his gaze shifted to the stone barrier that separated him from the men who could destroy him. "The federal investigators arrive in 6 days," he said slowly. "That gives us limited options." A chill colder than the mountain rock crept down Joe's spine. Blackwell wasn't just talking about silencing the surveyors. He was talking about erasing history. He was planning to eliminate every last trace of the Mackenzie family, every scrap of evidence that had somehow survived for 100 years. "What are your orders, sir?" Walsh asked, his voice quiet, resigned. "Seal this entire section permanently," Blackwell commanded. "All of it. The documents, the surveyors, everything that connects my family to the Mackenzie claims." A wave of panicked shouts erupted from behind the barrier. The trapped men had heard every word. They knew their fate was sealed, buried alongside the century-old crimes they had uncovered. But as Blackwell barked orders to his men, Joe's eyes, now accustomed to the dim light, noticed something everyone else had missed. Lying half-hidden under a surveyor's discarded jacket was another document. It wasn't a yellowed Mackenzie paper. It was a modern surveyor's report, and it contained detailed notes, maps of tunnel connections that stretched far beyond the single chamber. The Mackenzies had been smarter than anyone ever knew. They hadn't just hidden their legal papers in one spot. They had created a breadcrumb trail of evidence, scattered throughout a massive network of interconnected tunnels. Blackwell could seal this chamber. He could silence these men. But the truth had roots, and those roots ran deeper and spread wider than he could possibly imagine. Blackwell knelt, a king surveying the ruins of his empire, his face a grim mask in the lantern light. He sifted through the scattered Mackenzie documents, each yellowed page another piece of evidence confirming his family's century-long reign of crime. Forged deeds, stolen mining claims, a dynasty built on the wreckage of the territorial expansion. "These are more detailed than I expected," he muttered, his fingers tracing a hand-drawn map of the original Mackenzie territory. The map showed that the pioneering family had once owned nearly half of the mineral-rich land that now belonged to him. "They documented everything," he said to himself. "Everything before they were driven out." Joe watched from the shadows as Blackwell's men began to gather the historical evidence. But his attention was fixed on the modern surveyor's report he had spotted. He'd managed to inch closer, his fingers closing around the edge of the paper. With a slow, steady pull, he slid it into the darkness with him. He unfolded it carefully. The report was filled with precise measurements, but one line jumped out at him, scrawled in pencil. Extensive documentation cache found in connecting Chamber 7. The Mackenzies hadn't just left a trail. They had built a library of their own destruction, hidden deep in the mountain. "Sir," Walsh said, his voice careful, testing the waters, "even if we destroy these documents, the surveyors already photographed them. Their preliminary reports are already in federal hands." "I'm aware of that, Deputy," Blackwell replied, his voice dripping with ice. "Which is precisely why we need to discredit their findings before the investigators arrive. Without physical proof, their reports are just stories, allegations." Just then, a voice, weak but full of defiance, called out from behind the barrier. "You can't cover this up forever, Blackwell. The Mackenzie descendants filed the original complaint. They know their family's papers are hidden in here." Blackwell's head jerked towards the wall, his eyes narrowing. "Mackenzie descendants?" "Thomas Mackenzie's great-grandson," the voice continued, growing stronger. "He lives in Denver. He's the one who petitioned for the federal investigation. Even if you kill us, he won't stop searching. He will find his family's stolen legacy." Joe saw the last vestiges of color drain from Blackwell's face. This wasn't just about covering his own tracks anymore. This was a direct link to the past. Living heirs, actively seeking justice, and they had already brought the full weight of the federal government into it. "How much does this great-grandson know?" Blackwell demanded, his voice tight. "Everything we've discovered," came the defiant reply from behind the stone. "We've been corresponding with him throughout our survey. He's the one who told us the family stories, the legends of hidden documents and secret tunnel locations." Blackwell began to pace, a caged tiger, his heavy boots crushing the 100-year-old paper beneath his feet into dust. "Deputy Walsh," he snapped, "I want you to ride to town and send a telegram to Denver. Immediately, find this Mackenzie descendant. Find out exactly what he knows." "And if he knows too much?" Walsh asked, the question hanging in the cold, dead air like gun smoke. Joe held his breath. He was witnessing the pivot, the moment a desperate cover-up twisted into something much, much darker. Blackwell wasn't just trying to protect his fortune anymore. He was trying to preserve a criminal legacy that stretched back 4 generations, and he was willing to do anything to see it through. "One step at a time, Deputy," Blackwell said finally, his voice dangerously calm. He stopped his pacing and walked to the stone barrier, placing his palm flat against the ancient, cold rock. "Can you hear me in there?" "We hear you," came the weak response. "I'm prepared to make you an offer," Blackwell said, his voice smooth, reasonable. "Your lives in exchange for your complete and total silence about what you found here." A pause then, a weary voice from the darkness. "And if we refuse?" "Then you join the Mackenzie family," Blackwell said, his words chilling to the bone, "in their permanent rest." The threat echoed through the chamber, stark and brutal. Now Joe understood Clarabelle's fear. She knew the Blackwells. She knew what happened to families who stood in their way, both 100 years ago and right now. From behind the barrier, Joe could hear the men whispering, their voices a desperate murmur as they debated the impossible choice. He could hear the exhaustion, the dehydration, the despair. But beneath it all, he heard something else. A faint, rhythmic sound. Metal against stone. Purposeful. Quiet. They hadn't given up. Despite everything, the trapped men were still working. They were still fighting. And as long as they were, so was he. Somewhere in this dark, twisting maze of tunnels, the complete story of the Mackenzie family was waiting. Waiting for someone to finally bring it into the light. The quiet, rhythmic scrape of metal on stone from behind the barrier stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was deafening. Joe held his breath, straining to hear, as Lucius Blackwell stood like a predator, waiting for the trapped surveyors to accept his monstrous deal. The tension in the small chamber stretched thin, ready to snap. We need time to discuss this," a weak voice finally called out from behind the wall. "You have 5 minutes," Blackwell replied, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Then I seal this section permanently, whether you're silent or not." Joe watched as Blackwell's men took up positions around the chamber, their hands resting on their holstered pistols. They were preparing for the worst. Even Deputy Walsh looked pale and sick, his hand hovering near his own weapon, a man clearly wrestling with the monster he had become. During the tense, enforced silence, Joe carefully, quietly, studied the surveyor's report he'd managed to steal. The pages were filled with meticulous details, measurements of the tunnel system, geological notes. And then he saw it again, a circled reference, Chamber 7, Northern Branch Cache. The Mackenzies had been methodical. They had created multiple hidden libraries of their own history. Sir, Walsh whispered, leaning close to Blackwell, even if they agree to keep quiet, the federal investigators are still coming. Those preliminary reports were already filed. I'm aware of the problem, Deputy, Blackwell muttered back, not taking his eyes off the stone barrier. But if the investigators arrive and find no surveyors, no disturbance, and no physical evidence to support their claims, the investigation will wither and die. Government men need paper. They need proof. Without it, their reports are just rumors. Joe finally understood Blackwell's chilling endgame. It wasn't just about silencing these 5 men. It was about total erasure. He needed to physically obliterate every single piece of Mackenzie documentation hidden in this mountain. And the map to doing just that was right here, in Joe's hands. Behind the barrier, the urgent whispers continued. The trapped men were debating an impossible choice, a lie to live or the truth and death. But underneath their hushed conversation, Joe heard it again. That faint sound. The methodical scrape of metal against stone had started once more. It was quieter this time, more careful, but it was there. They weren't just debating, they were working. Time's up, Blackwell announced, his voice booming in the enclosed space. What is your decision? A long pause, then a reluctant, defeated reply. We agree. We agree to your terms, our silence, for our lives. A smart choice, Blackwell said, a thin, cruel smile touching his lips. He signaled to his men. Tom, start gathering every last one of these scattered documents. Walsh, you ride to town now. Send that telegram to Denver. But as his men moved to obey, sweeping the yellowed papers into a sack, Joe noticed something was wrong. Something was missing. He scanned the pile they were collecting. The original, foundational land deed, the one Tom had found first, wasn't there. And Thomas Mackenzie's final damning letter was gone too. Sir, Tom said, his voice laced with a new panic, some of the most important documents, they aren't here. The ones that specifically name your family. Blackwell's face, which had been relaxed in triumph, darkened into a thunderous scowl. He knew exactly what it meant. Either the surveyors had managed to hide the most critical pieces of evidence before being sealed in, or worse, someone else had taken them. His eyes, cold and sharp as chips of ice, swept the chamber, probing the deep shadows, searching for an unseen witness. Search every inch of this area, Blackwell commanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Those documents did not just grow legs and walk away. Joe pressed himself deeper into his hiding spot, the rough rock biting into his back. He was acutely aware of the missing papers, folded carefully and tucked securely inside his jacket. The 2 most explosive pieces of evidence, the ones that could bring down the entire Blackwell dynasty, were just inches away from the man who would kill to destroy them. And then, from behind the barrier, came a new sound, not the quiet scraping of metal against stone. This was a sharp, distinct crack, the sound of old, dry mortar breaking away from ancient rock. The trapped surveyors hadn't been debating his offer. They hadn't been trying to scrape a small hole. They had been planning their escape, and they were almost through. A large section of the stone barrier shifted, a visible shudder running through the wall as 100-year-old mortar crumbled and fell away like sand. Blackwell spun around, his face a mask of pure, murderous rage and disbelief. The surveyors had played him. They had been systematically weakening the entire ancient seal while pretending to negotiate for their lives. They're breaking through, Tom shouted, instinctively raising his rifle toward the compromised section of the wall. Don't shoot, you fool, Walsh yelled, his voice raw with urgency. A ricochet in this enclosed space will kill us all. Joe watched, his heart pounding in his chest, as several large stones tumbled inward, crashing to the floor and kicking up a cloud of century-old dust. The hole was big enough for a man to squeeze through. The surveyors, using their knowledge of engineering and whatever tools they had left, had located the weakest point in the old wall and concentrated all their efforts right there. A grimy, bloody hand snaked through the opening. It was followed by the bearded, haggard face of a man. The surveyor looked like he had been through hell, but his eyes burned with a fierce, unyielding determination. "The federal investigators are already on their way," he called out, his voice hoarse but strong. "You can't stop this anymore, Blackwell." Blackwell let out a roar of pure fury. He grabbed a heavy pickaxe from one of his men and stalked towards the crumbling barrier. "We'll see about that." He began swinging the pickaxe wildly, striking the stones around the opening, trying to bring the whole section of the wall down and bury the escaping men for good. But it was too late. The first surveyor had already pulled himself halfway through the gap. Behind him, in the darkness beyond the barrier, Joe could see other figures moving, helping him, pushing him through. All five of them were alive, and they were working together to break out of their stone prison. "The documents!" The bearded surveyor gasped as he stumbled out into the main chamber, falling to his knees. "Where are the Mackenzie papers?" "Being destroyed as we speak," Blackwell snarled, swinging the pickaxe again. More stones tumbled down, but the gap was only getting wider, the escape faster than his attempts to seal it. In that split second, Joe made his choice. The documents in his jacket were useless if they stayed hidden with him. They needed to get into the hands of someone who could get them to the authorities. He pulled out Thomas Mackenzie's original letter and the primary land deed. "Catch!" he yelled, his voice echoing from his hiding spot. He hurled the papers in a flat arc across the chamber. The surveyor, showing incredible reflexes for a man so weakened, snatched the papers out of the air. At the exact same moment, Blackwell whirled around, his face contorted with rage, his eyes locking onto the sound of Joe's voice. For a moment, the chamber descended into absolute chaos. More surveyors were squeezing through the rapidly widening gap in the wall. Blackwell's men were torn between trying to stop them and trying to recapture the scattered evidence. "There!" Tom shouted, pointing his rifle toward the pile of rocks where Joe was hidden. "Behind those rocks!" But Joe was already gone. He was moving, using the beautiful, chaotic confusion to scramble towards a narrow side passage he had noticed earlier. The surveyor's report had shown multiple tunnel connections. He had to reach the other document caches. He had to get to Chamber 7 before Blackwell's men did. "Stop him!" Blackwell roared, his voice cracking with desperation. "He has more of the papers." A gunshot exploded in the enclosed space, the sound deafening. The bullet ricocheted off the rock wall, inches from Joe's head as he dove headfirst into the side passage. The tunnel was impossibly narrow, barely wide enough for a man's shoulders. He was forced to crawl on his hands and knees, scrambling through the oppressive, absolute darkness. Behind him, he could hear Blackwell screaming orders, the sounds of a desperate, brutal struggle as the freed surveyors fought to protect their colleague and the precious documents he now held. The narrow passage suddenly opened up. Joe stumbled out into a much larger chamber. He fumbled for his lantern, his hands shaking as he struck a match. The flame caught, and the light bloomed, pushing back the darkness. The chamber was filled with old mining equipment, but more importantly, it was filled with wooden crates. Crates marked with a faded but still legible stencil. Mackenzie. This was it. Chamber 7. According to the surveyor's map, this was the mother lode. This was where Thomas Mackenzie had hidden his family's complete legacy, a time capsule of truth, just before he was driven from his home forever. And if the surveyor's report was accurate, this was just one of many such caches hidden throughout this mountain. Joe began pulling open the crates, his hands working feverishly. He knew Blackwell and his men would be right behind him. The final desperate battle for the Mackenzie legacy was about to begin, right here, 100 years after it was first hidden. The lantern light cast long, dancing shadows as Joe ripped the lid off the first wooden crate. The sheer scope of what Thomas Mackenzie had done took his breath away. This wasn't just a few papers. It was an entire archive of injustice. Dozens of original land deeds, meticulously filed. Mining claims marked with precise boundaries. Territorial maps that showed the true vast extent of the Mackenzie family's holdings. They had legally owned nearly half of the mineral-rich territory that now formed the bedrock of the Blackwell Empire. It was all stolen, Every last acre. His fingers brushed against a heavy, leather-bound journal. He opened it. Thomas Mackenzie's personal account. Page after page, written in a steady, determined hand, detailed the systematic campaign of terror and fraud that had cost his family everything. He named names. He listed dates. He described the specific crimes, the forged documents, the bribed officials, the armed men who came in the night. It was all there, documented with the cold, hard precision of a man who knew he was writing for history. A man who was recording evidence for a day of justice he would never live to see. A sound, the scrape of boots on rock, echoing from the narrow passage he'd just crawled through. They were coming. Blackwell's men were on his trail, and they were approaching fast. Joe grabbed the journal and stuffed it inside his jacket, along with a handful of the most crucial deeds. He had to find another way out. He swept his lantern beam across the chamber. The surveyor's map had shown multiple connections, but all he could see were solid rock walls. "He's in here," Tom's voice, muffled but clear, carried through the passage. "There's nowhere else for him to go." Joe killed his lantern, plunging the chamber into absolute suffocating blackness. He pressed himself against the wall, his hands feeling their way along the rough, hewn rock. And then he felt it, a faint draft of cold air. It was coming from behind a tall stack of old rotting wooden crates. Another passage, concealed for a century by dust and debris. A spot of light appeared at the entrance to the chamber. Blackwell squeezed through the narrow opening, his face a mask of pure fury in the lantern light. "End of the line, Drifter," he snarled. "Hand over those documents." "Thomas Mackenzie documented everything, Blackwell," Joe called out, his voice echoing in the darkness. He worked quietly, desperately, trying to shift the heavy crates blocking the hidden passage while he kept Blackwell talking. "Every crime, every forged deed, every official your family bought and paid for. The truth has been waiting for you here for 100 years. The truth means nothing without proof," Blackwell shot back, raising his own lantern higher, its beam cutting through the darkness, searching for him. "And in about 5 minutes, there won't be any proof left." Behind Blackwell, Tom appeared. In his hands, he held a thick bundle of dynamite sticks, their fuses dangling like snakes. Joe's blood ran cold. They weren't just here for the papers. They were going to collapse the entire tunnel system. They were going to bury the Mackenzie legacy, and him along with it, under thousands of tons of rock. "Your family built its fortune on stolen land," Joe continued, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. He gave one of the crates a hard shove. It moved a few inches. "But Thomas Mackenzie was smarter than you ever gave him credit for. He didn't just hide his documents in one place." "What do you mean?" Blackwell demanded, taking a step forward. "He scattered evidence throughout every tunnel, every mine shaft, every cave system in these mountains," Joe said, bluffing, embellishing what he knew from the surveyor's report. "The surveyors found 17 different caches before you trapped them. Destroying this one chamber won't do you any good. You'll never find them all." Blackwell's confident sneer wavered, just for a second. The idea of evidence being distributed across miles of underground passages, a task that would take months, maybe years to fully eradicate. The thought clearly rattled him. "You're lying," he said, but the conviction in his voice was gone. Doubt had crept in. "The federal investigators will find it all," Joe said, finally pulling the last crate away, revealing the dark, narrow opening of the hidden passage. "They have the surveyor's complete maps. They have Thomas Mackenzie's own notes on his distribution system. They know every cache location, every secret tunnel connection." "Boss," Tom said, his voice urgent, holding up the dynamite. "We need to decide. Now. This much explosive will bring down half the mountain." Blackwell stood frozen, his mind racing, weighing his impossible options. And in that moment of hesitation, a new sound reached them. It echoed from the main tunnel system, growing louder with every second. The sound of many voices. Men moving fast, calling out commands. The escaped surveyors had found help. The federal investigators had arrived. And they had arrived early. The voices of the federal investigators grew louder, a wave of authority washing through the dark tunnels, guided by the very men Blackwell had left for dead. Lucius Blackwell's face went ashen. He looked like a man watching his entire world crumble to dust around him. The century-long cover-up, the dark legacy passed down through 4 generations, was finally irrevocably collapsing. "Boss, we have to go now," Tom urged, his eyes wide with panic as he held the bundle of dynamite. "If we bring down this section, we can still get out through the northern passages." But Joe could see it in Blackwell's eyes. It was over. The game was up. There were too many loose ends. The scattered evidence, the federal investigation, the living witnesses who had literally just broken out of their tomb. The truth that Thomas Mackenzie had so carefully preserved in 1792 was finally seeing the light in 1892, exactly 100 years later. "Mr. Blackwell," a new voice, calm and commanding, called from the entrance to the chamber. "Federal Marshal Davidson, we have a warrant for your arrest on charges of land fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder." Blackwell closed his eyes, his shoulders slumping under the immense weight of his family's crimes. "My great-grandfather started this," he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. "I was just trying to protect what he built. By trapping innocent men in a mine and planning to kill them," Joe said, stepping out from behind the wooden crates, the Mackenzie journals and deeds clutched tightly in his hands. "It's the same pattern of violence Thomas Mackenzie described in his journals." The federal marshal, a tall man with a grim, determined face, appeared in the chamber entrance. He was flanked by armed deputies and the 5 railroad surveyors. They were dirty, exhausted, and gaunt, but they stood tall, their eyes fixed on the man who had tried to bury them alive. "Mr. Hollister, I presume," the marshal said, nodding towards Joe. "These gentlemen tell me you're responsible for preserving this crucial evidence." Joe stepped forward and handed over the complete Mackenzie documentation, the papers that had waited a patient century for this exact moment. "Thomas Mackenzie hid 17 different caches throughout these tunnels," he explained. "Every crime, every forged deed, every stolen claim. It's all in here." Marshal Davidson took the yellowed papers, his expert eyes scanning the contents. "These will restore the rightful ownership of this land to dozens of families whose property was stolen during the territorial expansion," he said, his voice ringing with the finality of justice. "The Mackenzie descendants in Denver have been fighting for this evidence for years. Now they have it." Seeing the armed deputies moving in, Tom dropped the bundle of dynamite and slowly raised his hands. Deputy Walsh, his face a mask of shame and defeat, stepped forward and offered his wrist without a word, his career in his honor utterly destroyed. "The railroad survey will proceed as planned," Marshal Davidson announced to the surveyors. "This entire tunnel system will be preserved as evidence, and all legitimate mining claims will be honored according to the original territorial agreements." Blackwell was led away in shackles, his face a stony mask of defeat. The empire built on 100 years of lies and violence crumbled to dust with every step he took down the tunnel. The man who had inherited a criminal dynasty would now spend the rest of his life paying for its legacy. Joe watched them go, a quiet sense of satisfaction settling over him. For the first time in a long, long time, he felt like he had a purpose beyond just surviving another day. Old Clarabelle had seen something in him. She had known he was the only person desperate enough, with nothing left to lose, who would risk everything to see justice done. The drifter, the outcast, had become the key that unlocked 100 years of buried truth. As the federal investigators began the long, meticulous process of cataloging the mountain of evidence in the Mackenzie caches, Joe slipped away. He found the concealed passage he'd discovered earlier and vanished back into the mountain's embrace. The world was wide, and there were other forgotten places, other buried secrets, waiting for someone willing to look. Behind him, the voices of justice echoed through the tunnels, finally breaking a silence that had lasted for exactly 100 years. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.